welcome. If you saw the 2011 film Moneyball, then you know how big data changed the business of baseball. The insight was when hiring players, forget subjective impressions. If you crunch the past performance numbers, you'll know who will really help the team. Well, soon the rest of us may get crunched, that is, hired or rejected by the numbers of what we do online. We'll get to that in a minute. Also on the program, in our public intellectual segment, where we look at research with the power to change our minds and public policy, we'll hear about a new EPA study showing blood pressure medicines and painkillers spiking our drinking water. Plus, today we'll meet a high-tech startup fighting low literacy. Then, towards the end of the hour, my brother, writer-designer Warren Lehrer, will drop by to tell us about the rise and fall of the fictional but very prolific novelist Blue Mobley. But first, with so many Americans looking for work nowadays, corporate human resources departments sometimes rely on search algorithms to sift through all the candidates and see what we are doing online. And that's just the beginning of how HR is using data about us to step up their game. Joining us are Ask the Headhunter host, Nick Corcodilos. Nick is also the author of Fearless Job Hunting. And joining us via Skype from Washington, D.C., Don Peck, who has researched the role of people analytics in the workplace for The Atlantic magazine. Don is the author of Pinched, How the Great Recession Has Narrowed Our Futures and What We Can Do About It. Welcome, gentlemen. Thanks for coming.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Don, this phrase, people analytics, what does that actually mean?
Well, it refers to the use of, as you said at the intro, data that companies are acquiring via web searches to see our online behavior, the open source code we may write, the way we use language online, and data from online tests or specially designed games that we play to assess our potential for specific job roles. And what companies are doing increasingly is they are marrying that evaluative data with performance once we get into work, and they're using that to see, what really makes for a successful worker in a given role. It's a very new field in many ways, but many companies are beginning to experiment aggressively with it.
And how far do they go with these people analytics? Is it just tests that you know you're taking for the benefit of your job application, or are they poking around online through your Twitter feed and what you've done on Google and that kind of thing, like we hear the colleges do for the high school students who apply?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit of both. Look, companies already are looking at your Facebook feed. Many of them, just their individual people in HR are doing it. But I think so. What's happening now? What's most pronounced today is for hourly work, for standardized jobs that are large in number and don't require typically extremely high levels of skill. Companies are very widely using online tests that test personality, they test specific skills and types of cognitive intelligence. But they also test things that you might not be aware of, like what browser you're actually using, which apparently can correlate to success in certain roles. People who use Internet Explorer, which comes with many computers but is often considered an inferior browser, might be seen to be less proactive, less technically apt. Right. That's been correlated with a lack of success in certain jobs. So that's what's going on in the main, but there are companies as well, particularly for jobs like software programmers, that beyond people who have applied for jobs, they're sending out their algorithms around the web, and they're trying to evaluate essentially all programmers all the time through their online work products, through the way they use language, through other correlates of good programming. And in so doing, they're hoping to identify undervalued programmers that might work for their competitors, people with non-traditional backgrounds that they might otherwise miss, and they're trying to kind of widen the net and seek job candidates more intelligently.
Pretty interesting. Interesting that they're even looking at what browser we use. So Nick, tell us on the ground, who do you work with? Do you work mostly with job seekers, or as Ask the Headhunter would suggest with companies looking for qualified talent? What do you do?
As a headhunter, I work with employers who retain me to come in and fill positions, but asktheheadhunter.com is a website that's been around for 15 years at this point, where I basically answer questions from readers who are looking for new, innovative ways, common sense ways to land a job. There's a lot of rigmarole around the job hunting process that just doesn't work. People don't realize that fewer than 10% of jobs are actually filled through job boards, through big data, if you will. What really seems to be going on is HR and employers in a lot of ways have been driving big data off a cliff. They have so automated the process, and in the process dumbed it down, that they're really not talking to people. These correlations that we look at often don't mean a whole lot because they're very indirect measurements of what people are doing.
But when you say dumbed it down, it's just the opposite of what they must think they're doing. They think they're using smart technology to figure out details of the applicants, to compare each other, or even just to assess somebody on a scale.
I think the issue is they're looking at data about people that have nothing to do with their performance at a particular task that they'd be doing on the job. Back in 1905, when the IQ test was developed, what we learned is that the only accurate assessment you can make to predict someone's success at work or in academia is to take a look at task-specific metrics that look at what people are actually doing on a job. When you're looking at what websites people are going to, whether they're visiting manga sites, the correlations are almost spurious. They don't really tell you anything other than that there is a correlation.
Don, do you agree? This is dumb hiring in pursuit of smart hiring?
I think it can be. I mean, I think the main thing that we need to recognize is that it's very early on in this process, and whether it's dumb or smart, it's going to affect a lot of people. I'm sure that there are companies that will overreach, that will automate too much and not interview enough. And I'm sure that some of the correlates will turn out to be spurious. But I don't agree that we can say right now that this is a dumbing down. I think that one thing that distinguishes this process is, only recently have we been able kind of digitally to see so many correlates of potential performance. And again, what companies are doing here is fundamentally empirical. They're evaluating people, and then they are tracking them through their time at a company. So over time, they're going to be able to see, is a particular indicator in fact predictive of success at a job? So I mean, I think it's to some extent, I'm persuaded that it will be a self-correcting.
Right. So they're quantifying. But Nick, a question would be, are they looking at the right metrics? And I wonder if you think this kind of hiring or a promotion tool even winds up biasing employers in favor or against certain groups, or if maybe it starts to weed out the bias because they're looking at these objective measures.
I think the big problem, Brian, is that in trying to solicit and attract as many people as possible, whether you're doing a metric or whether you're soliciting through a job board or through an applicant tracking system, companies complain today that they can't possibly process all the applicants they get in personalized ways. And yet they've in fact created the problem themselves, because what they're doing is soliciting and encouraging people to apply blindly to virtually every job that's available online. When you get that kind of activity going on, you naturally need some way to weed people out. If on the other hand, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, companies didn't have this problem of too many applicants. What they were doing was, in a more personal way, going out and looking where people were looking where the right people were hanging out. People ask me, where do you find your candidates? I go hang out with the people that my clients need hang out. I go get to know them, whether it's online, it could be virtually, it may be actually in person. I think what's being lost in management nowadays, managers are getting to the point where they really don't believe they have to interview anyone. They want to hire through metrics, and the false positives, the false negatives, good people are being missed because they're relying on data rather than on personal interactions.
Don, give us an example of one of these companies. For example, what does the firm known as Knack do?
Yeah, so Knack is a tiny startup, and they create video games. You can download some of them on your iPhone or smartphone. But the games are designed by neurologists and statisticians and industrial organization psychologists to suss out human potential, to assess social intelligence, to assess your personality in some ways, and to assess various cognitive skills. And what they're doing is they're basically having successful employees at individual roles at individual companies play their games, seeing what profile they have, and again, they're trying to match or correlate that to patterns of play among applicants as a way of doing some screening. It's very early days, but they've had results that I think are encouraging to date.
And Nick, you're familiar with something called Talio?
Yes, I am.
What is that?
Talio is a massive applicant tracking system. It's a company that basically helps companies track people and collect massive amounts of data on them. Talio is actually the back end for a lot of systems that companies use to figure out who they want to interview, to track them while they're interviewing them. Again, it can be a useful process, but it can also be an incredibly depersonalizing process that by trying to objectify the process, we wind up missing a lot of cues that you simply can't capture that way.
So what's your recommendation to individuals who are job hunting in this environment?
My advice to them is throw your resume in the trash, stop applying for jobs online, don't consent to be metriced, if that's a word. Instead, go hang out with the kinds of people that you want to work with, hang out. Socialize with them, get to know them, show them who you are and what you can do, and get introduced to their bosses. That one-on-one approach. The reason companies...
That's like pre-internet, old-fashioned networking.
I make a living online, Brian, so I'm the last one to trash doing anything online. But when you consider, follow the money, if you will. Companies pay headhunters like me $30,000 to $40,000 to fill a position. They'll pay an online job board $50 to access 1,000 resumes. So why the delta? What they're getting from me or from any other headhunter, and I'm not promoting headhunters here, there's nothing mysterious about what we do. What they get from us is 2 or 3 highly qualified, personally checked out people who can do the work. What I say to managers all the time is, why, when you can ask a job candidate, an applicant, for virtually anything you want, why do you ask for a bunch of keywords and for a resume and a document about their history when you can ask them to show you how they would do the work profitably for you?
Don, same question. What's your recommendation to job seekers?
Well, I mean, I think that job seekers should kind of promiscuously, use what tools are available to them. So I would certainly recommend networking and in-person contact. That's been a very, very good way to get a job historically. But I think it's very important for job seekers as well to maintain active profiles online, to watch the way they use language, particularly on professional social networks, and to use all the tools available to them. One thing I do want to say before we end is, we often, in looking at new technologies, we often presume the current system must be working pretty well. Actually, the current system is rife with biases of its own, and any number of scholarly studies have shown that tall men get promoted and make more money more than short men. Beauty matters, race matters, gender matters. So I think it's important to recognize as technologies begin to change the way some people are hired, that there is a lot of room for improvement too. And I think that one thing used properly can act as a check on the other.
Looks like employers have nothing on the NSA in today's job market, or the NSA has nothing on them. Thank you very much for joining us,
Brian.
Both of you. Up next, the study shows more traces of blood pressure meds and painkillers in our water supply than researchers expected. Our public intellectual segment is next. You may be swallowing small doses of oxycodone and ibuprofen and not even know it. It's time for Public Intellectual, where we examine new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. A new national study from the Environmental Protection Agency reveals there's a lot more prescription and over-the-counter drugs getting into the nation's water than drug companies predicted. The study of 50 large-size wastewater treatment plants is published in the journal Environmental Pollution, authored by research biologist Mitchell Kostich. He joins us via Adobe Connect from Cincinnati, Ohio. Hello from New York. Thank you for coming on with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And viewers, forgive the slight delay in the sound from Cincinnati. But tell us, what led you to do this study in the first place? Was there a suspicion about prescription drugs in the water supply?
Well, there have been a number of research groups who've been looking at pharmaceuticals actually since the early 80s. And all the studies that have been conducted were pretty small, but they showed that you could find a wide variety of pharmaceuticals in surface water particularly. So that's waters and streams and rivers, things like that. And it's been known for a long time. I mean, it's kind of obvious that pharmaceuticals are designed to have a biological effect, and they are generally designed to have a biological effect at as small a dose as the manufacturers can work out. So, you put this together, on the one hand, the widespread occurrence of these drugs, and on the other hand, the known biological activity at low concentrations, and that sort of raised concerns that there might be effects either on humans or on aquatic life.
And did you find effects either on humans or on aquatic life?
Well, we didn't actually study effects directly, but because the concern about the low concentrations came from the fact that the doses of these drugs can often, they can have medicinal effects at very low doses. What we did is we compared the concentrations that we found in water to the doses that are typically used in a clinical setting. And when we do that, we find that, we also found that you could find a wide variety of pharmaceuticals out there, but the concentrations are incredibly low. So if you were, most people drink up to maybe a half a gallon of water a day. And we were actually looking in wastewater. So this is the water that's coming out of septic treatment plants. So this isn't the water that people normally would be looking at. And so, but it contributes to the surface waters that the drinking water plants take in and treat to make the water that comes out of your taps. And so we're looking at kind of the dirtiest point in the pathway, which is the wastewater that's coming from these wastewater treatment plants. And we look at the concentrations there, assuming you were drinking 2 liters a day of wastewater, about half a gallon a day of wastewater. In the worst case, you'd be getting slightly less than a minimum daily dose of drug in a year of drinking half a gallon a day of such wastewater. And for most of the drugs we looked at, it would take more than a lifetime of drinking half a gallon a day to get a full dose of drug. So for the most part, the concentrations, they're out there. The concentrations are measurable, but to some degree, that's reflecting the sensitivity of the methods that are used to do the analysis, more so than the fact that you're going to, affect your blood pressure or something like that by taking or fight a bacterial infection by drinking water. The doses are nowhere near. The concentrations are nowhere near the levels that would be needed to reproduce a clinically effective dose.
But they could be going up, and I think that's what most surprised you about your findings, right? How much there was, even at these levels that you've been just describing, compared to what you were expecting or compared to what there was in the past?
Well, we had been doing some modeling in the past, and actually we had predicted, the modeling was done in a very conservative way. We didn't really know how much of the drug would be removed in the course of wastewater treatment, and so we assumed that none would be. And when we do that, we actually ended up with predictions that were somewhat higher than what we actually measured. I think maybe the surprising parts of the study was how many drugs of particular classes we found out there, particularly the blood pressure medications. But still, when you look at it, yeah, we do expect that medicine use is going up as we have an aging population and wider access to medical services generally. But still, the margin there between the effective dose and the concentration is on the order of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. So that, even if you saw a doubling or tripling in the amount of drug that's being used, you're still not going to get anywhere near the sorts of doses that we know can cause biological effects.
So tell us what's in the water. What are the medications that you found primarily?
So the ones that we found at both the highest concentrations and the most often were the anti-hypertensive drugs. So these are the drugs that people who have high blood pressure would be taking. We also found some statins, which are drugs that are used to combat high cholesterol. And we found a number of psychiatric medications, both anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, and drugs that are used to combat both bipolar disorder and epilepsy.
And painkillers, I mentioned that in the introduction. Ibuprofen, oxycodone, a lot?
We found a lot of things, but including the painkillers, but the painkillers were at somewhat lower levels, especially when you compare them to the doses that are effective in a clinical setting. So they're out there, and in fact, we found probably members of every class that you can think of. But the ones, again, that we found in the highest concentrations relative to the normal doses that would be used in a clinic, and the ones that we found most often across, in some cases, all 50 of the wastewater treatment plants that we looked at, were the blood pressure medications, the antibiotics, and some of the psychiatric medications.
So is it a reflection in our water of what people are taking the most of in America today?
Yeah, very much so, although there also seems to be an aspect of which drugs actually make it through the wastewater treatment process. Wastewater treatment wasn't really designed to remove these chemicals for the most part, especially the traditional wastewater treatment methods. They were targeting more things like nitrogen and phosphorus, these nutrients that cause dead zones down in the Gulf of Mexico and these kind of things. So those are the kind of prime and to get rid of pathogens, microbes that can cause disease that are released by sick people into the wastewater treatment system.
So we're likely to see more marijuana residue in Colorado and Washington State in the next few years.
Almost certainly. Yeah, you can also see, and there have been other studies, that wasn't really the focus of our work, but other people have looked at the concentrations of metabolites of controlled substances. Marijuana, is still going to be controlled for some time. And you can actually back calculate to some degree what usage rates are in an area. So they do reflect the usage rates in the area, and you would expect in an area where something becomes legalized that probably the concentrations would go up, presuming that legalization leads to increased use.
Because to be clear, you're measuring in effect not the throwaway drugs, the excess of whatever prescription that people may be flushing down the toilets. This is human waste, and what in effect is reflecting what we've taken.
Yeah, I mean, it's our belief that primarily, and we have a lot of reasons just kind of thinking about how much gets thrown away versus how much gets used, that the majority of what we're looking at represents what's passed through a patient's body. But there's no doubt that a lot of people dispose of excess medicines by flushing them down the toilet, so that to some degree is going to be reflected in our numbers as well.
If you have small amounts of medications, but of many medications, should we be concerned that they might interact with each other and have some kind of biological effect on people through the drinking water a little down the road?
Certainly you would suspect that you might see greater aggregate effects from mixtures of drugs than you would see from individual drugs. And we looked at this a little bit in a couple studies that we did, related studies. And what we found, though, is that you're typically the exposure rates when you add everything up are about 2 to 3 times greater than what you would see if you were just looking at the drugs that had the largest individual concentrations. And that's because certain drugs tend to dominate the market. So if you look at blood pressure medications, there's several of them that are pretty common. But if you look in other drug classes, there's typically 1, 2, maybe 3 drugs that kind of dominate the market. And so you don't, even though there might be 10 Me Too sorts of drugs that are in the list, they're typically used at such low levels that they don't make a significant impact on the aggregate concentration.
So is the takeaway from your study, don't worry, be happy? Or is it, we have to monitor how much of an increase there may be over time in the number of pharmaceuticals and the concentrations of pharmaceuticals in our water, and maybe develop better wastewater treatment methods to deal with it?
So there's over 1,000 active pharmaceutical ingredients that are approved for use out there. And I'd say on the order of about 95% of those, we really aren't very concerned about them based on our studies and data coming from other studies. But there's a few there that it's a little less clear what might be happening to someone who maybe has an allergy to a drug, who might be sensitive to an incredibly low dose of drug, or what might be happening to fish in the water. And we don't have any data to suggest that there are problems, but it's harder to rule out those risks, and we think those are worth additional study.
And does it mean the FDA has to go back to the drug companies? Because if I understand what I read correctly, this is more than the drug companies predicted that would be in the water from their products. Maybe I shouldn't be surprised by that.
We don't know in what context those estimates are coming up. My understanding is that those estimates are often made before the drug actually hits the market, so it's probably no surprise that they can be a little bit off.
Well, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Officially, the United States has a 99% literacy rate. But if you look more closely, some studies suggest only 1/3 of elementary school students read proficiently. Only 1/4 of high school grads have the range of reading skills needed to succeed in today's information economy. This is hardly news to teachers, but they may not know about some high-tech tools available to them and their students. One of those internet platforms is Clovey. Particularly interesting because this startup was built by a group of young minority grads from the University of Michigan with the help of top literacy experts. Harlan Pacheco, co-founder of Clovey, joins us in the studio, and via Skype from Washington, Andres Hernandez, program director for the Division of Research on Learning at the National Science Foundation. Welcome to both of you. Why did you start Clovey?
Thanks so much for having us on the show. I want to tell you a little bit more about us. The literacy crisis is something that hits home for many of the founders of Clovey. Many of us are first-generation immigrants into the country. We picked up a new language when we set foot into urban schools primarily. Many of us also have family and friends who are not as fortunate as us to attain higher education from the University of Michigan, not just a bachelor's degree, but also master's degrees. And so really our passion is for transforming opportunity for low-income communities and for communities of color. And we feel like the literacy crisis is one important step. Addressing the literacy crisis is one important step that we can take to prepare students for this information economy that we face today. Some of the statistics that you mentioned at the beginning of the show are exactly spot on. And those statistics disproportionately affect communities of color and low-income communities. And we feel that empowering kids and students with this foundational skill for acquiring any form of knowledge is one of the most impactful things that we can do.
And one of the problems is that educators haven't had the right tools?
Yeah, exactly. So a few things are happening right now that are really extraordinary and wonderful for education technology. Device adoption is skyrocketing across schools. It's not only tablets, it's also Chromebooks. Chromebooks were the best-selling laptop on Amazon this past fall, and I have a hunch that a lot of those Chromebooks are actually going to students. Why? Because they're very, very affordable. And so what we did is create this very intuitive platform that can be deployed to schools and used across any kind of device that's deployed in those schools, across any kind of browser. It makes it easy for teachers to assign a set of books, to assign a set of lessons and assessments, and to gather really great data on what students are understanding and what they perhaps need some additional help with.
Andres, how much of this literacy problem is a language problem? That is, how much is that people are first or second generation immigrants, maybe English language learners, at the same time that the government is demanding higher measures of literacy for today's world?
Yeah, well, Brian, thanks for having me on your show, first of all. The issue is that the country is going through a major shift in terms of the requirements that they're expecting of students to read in schools, and those come with higher standards, of course. And the challenge is that our young people who are coming in from different countries are facing a double challenge, if you will. They are facing the challenge of first learning English language, and then they are facing the challenge of actually learning the language of the content itself. So one can argue that there's the content and the language of science and the content and the language of mathematics is quite different. And so these youngsters are having a double challenge, if you will, learning the language as well as learning the content language. Now,
go ahead.
Yeah, that said, there are struggling adolescents, especially youngsters around the 8th grade, that are seen as particularly challenging. But we do see that the youngsters who are immigrants are coming to this country have the most challenge, but we still see second, third generation English language learners who are still very much challenged with reading very complex text within schools.
And we're going to look at the Clovey website in just a minute. But do you think in general it is a matter of tools? Because some people watching right now may be thinking, well, this is the most basic thing in the world, teaching kids to read. And before the internet, before even the computer, we taught kids to read. And it's a matter of human-to-human interaction, adult-to-child interaction, and designing good books and things like that. So is this about tools, or to what degree do you think it is about tools?
Well, we've had those tools for a really long time. They're called books. I think, and we've had those tools for thousands of years. And of course, how we use those tools and the ways in which we use those tools in order to teach reading and writing is absolutely essential. We have yet the real research evidence to know whether online tools such as Clovey or any other tool online platform, while it does increase access to books because it's much easier for folks who necessarily may not have a library card or have access to Amazon or whatever, it certainly increases access to a number of books, but we have yet the evidence to know whether it actually demonstrates much stronger teaching tools than, say, reading and writing, or showing youngsters how to read and write.
All right, so Harlan, talk us into some of this. Let's take a visit to the Clovey website.
Yeah, I think Andres brought up some really fascinating points. A couple of things come to mind. One is that building those foundational literacy skills of phonics, fluency, vocabulary acquisition, and decoding skills are really valuable, but also that practice, the development of conceptual knowledge, of more sophisticated vocabulary is very important, as educators will know. And so some of the elements, I guess, and some of the design principles that we took when we designed Clovey is thinking about not only readily available, very relatable, and high quality collection of books that are all organized not only according to specific genres, but also specific reading levels and abilities. And so you'll notice that one of the things that we did is make sure that we assigned Lexile measures, which is essentially just a number that indicates the reading complexity of a text. We also made sure that we align books to the Common Core State Standards as grade ranges to demonstrate what books are particularly good at addressing the reading needs of specific grades. But it's also making sure that we also have really high quality lessons that are linked to these texts. When we created lessons inside of the Clovey experience, we not only made sure that they were aligned to those texts and aligned to specific grades and to standards, but also made sure that they're building those higher level literacy skills that Andres and you were suggesting are important for the innovation economy. It's now the ability to evaluate the quality of an argument. It's the ability for a student to extract the key ideas and details of the text. And these are the kinds of skills that educators are being expected to implement, and we're making sure that we create tools that make it easy for them to implement these skills. And so we're also gathering really great data on what students are doing behind these books after they're completing these great lessons. It's not only about the quality of the mastery and their understanding of specific skills that I was just alluding to. It's also about being able to give them really great feedback on the quality of a writing that they use to respond to a prompt, for
Now,
example.
this is very interesting what's on the screen right
Yeah.
now. How would you rewrite the story? That's a creative thinking kind of exercise.
Yeah.
That may not have been on old style tests,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. We have this really awesome graphic organizer that's embedded into the reading experience that allows students to organize their thoughts as they're reading, to capture some of that evidence that they're going to use to be able to tell a different kind of narrative. This is a narrative exercise. Or if they were going to respond to other kinds of prompts that were perhaps expository or persuasive prompts, they would also be really good at helping them gather that evidence. And we also make it really great for educators and easy for educators to give students that feedback on the quality of that writing with rubrics that they're very used to.
Well, Andres, are we, between programs like Clovey and the Common Core standards and how they're supposed to emphasize critical thinking compared to the way we measured student performance in the past, are we almost redefining literacy these days?
Well, what we're doing with literacy, I think, is a much more emphasis on what we call the complex text or informational text. I think for many, many years, the emphasis was on teaching children to read, but we weren't teaching children to read to learn and read to understand. And so the huge emphasis in the Common Core state standards and the next generation standards, which, by the way, the National Science Foundation does not support, I want to say clearly, or we don't not support them, but we're not behind them. I want to make sure that your audience understands that.
You're not giving them money is what you're saying, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. It is demanding the youngsters to read much more deeply into complex informational text, expository text. So that is a huge change, and the kinds of changes that are going to require both teachers to teach in a very different ways, in the ways in which they can scaffold their lessons, if you will, not just to teach, but to ensure that students are actually understanding what they're reading and writing about. And what teacher in science or mathematics wouldn't want their children to understand the content? Every teacher would. So that's going to be the demands of those new standards. And I do applaud it in the sense that we are seeing our nation, our at least our fourth graders, see a slight edge in the ways in which, and the success rates that we've been having. But we go flatline as soon as we get youngsters into the 8th grade, and a deeper decline when we get kids into the 12th grade. So that is something that we are going to address head on.
Well, it's a start anyway. Yours is a startup. So this is a for-profit company?
Yeah.
How do you hope to make money?
A few different ways. One, startups generate value in a couple of different ways. In our case, we are going to universally distribute and make our tools available for free to any educator using any kind of public domain or open educational resources. The second ways is we actually have partnered with a lot of publishers, 12 of them so far, that are hoping to take advantage or to understand the opportunity to digitally distribute materials that are being used in these more interesting and complex ways. So we've partnered with a lot of publishers to render their content and deploy them inside of our interactive e-reader. And we're charging very minimal subscription costs on a per student basis.
And you have an angel, so-called, a big investor to help you start up, right?
Yeah. So we were very fortunate not only to have received support from Mitch Kapoor, as a wonderful angel investor, one of the founders of Lotus Notes. We also were very fortunate to have won the Gates Foundation Literacy Courseware Challenge. We were one of those winners, and to have become Echoing Green Brackmail Achievement Fellows. And I think the common thread across the supporters that we've received to back our idea to close gaps in literacy is that they care about not only startups and not only social entrepreneurship, but they care about social entrepreneurship that generates measurable impact. In our case, we're going to make sure that we accelerate literacy achievement for the kids who need it most.
So what would be the best way to measure your program's impact?
A couple of different ways. One, we're gathering lots of really wonderful data on just how many skills students are developing mastery, proficiency, growth, and understanding of. And we're also capturing lots of data on how many pages kids are reading, the kinds of books that kids are reading, and if along the way they're gathering lots of that evidence, for example, that we highlighted in that graphic organizer that could be used to illustrate arguments. There's a wonderful combination and different permutations of statistical analyses that we can run on that, and we're really looking forward to doing that over the coming years.
Well, good luck. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you, Brian.
With us now, the writer and designer Warren Lehrer, who happens to be my brother. Warren's newest volume is called A Life in Books, The Rise and Fall of Blue Mobley. Some of you may know his last work, the acclaimed Crossing the Boulevard, which was about immigrants to Queens from all over the world. This latest is Warren's 10th book and his first novel. He also teaches at SUNY Purchase and is a founding faculty member of the Designer as Author program at the School of Visual Arts, and as such he calls this new book an illuminated novel written and designed by Warren Lehrer. Hi.
Hi.
So before we show people some of the many cool book covers within the book and some videos that are related to the book, describe for people who don't know it this whole field of designer as author or author as designer. This runs the gamut from books that are mostly text with a few illustrations to kind of visual art books with a little text. How would you describe the field?
Well, there are some of us who can't help but write in a way that the writing, the composition of the writing happens simultaneously as a visual form. So for me, it's been about trying to translate the shape of thought on the page, like what does thought look like as it meanders from one place to another, or the nature of a kind of discourse, dialogue between two people. What is the relationship between those people, and how that can manifest through typography. Sometimes my books also incorporate images, and this, of course, you've got illuminated manuscripts and pattern poetry. There's a great ancient tradition of literature that it's visual, but there's an explosion now
graphic novels,
Graphic novels.
serious literature in comic book form.
And more of these peculiar, maybe 5 out of 10 new works of fiction where things are happening on the page, where the author, now maybe because they have more access to a computer in the way that they're writing, are thinking visually about the writing.
So set this up for our viewers with respect to your book. You have a fictional fiction writer who
He writes nonfiction.
He has some
sometimes.
nonfiction books in there. We'll get to that and how that's an interesting plot twist. But 101 books within your one book.
Yes, and he is in prison. Blue Mobley finds himself in prison, and he's looking back in this book on his life and career, whispering into a microcassette recorder from the darkness of his prison cell. And what I've done is taken this memoir and juxtaposed it with a kind of monographic retrospective of his life's work, which includes having written 101 books. So you get all 101 covers of the books and also excerpts of 34 of the 101 books, many of which read like short stories.
All right, and again, to be clear, this author, Blue Mobley, does not exist. This is a novel about a fictional author. The real author, Warren Lehrer, is here. And let's take a look at some of these book covers of these 101 books. And Warren, you're going to talk us through some of this. What is this?
So this is his very first book that he composed in the basement letterpress shop of his junior high school in the western edge of Queens, the Joan of Arc Junior High. Letterpress a la Gutenberg, metal type, one letter at a time. And it's about a magical experience he had one day with his manic depressive artist mother at a marshland in New Jersey. And so right here you get the beginning of what sets him off for a lifetime of trying to make sense of his life by writing and designing books.
The grandest art show in the world. Next cover.
Actually, we're seeing a page spread from A Life in Books now of several of his famous father books, a series of books, because Blue didn't have a father. His mother never told him who his father was, but his Aunt Chloe, who had a few too many gin and tonics one night, said that his father was a very famous man who, because of his fame and having a family of his own, had to cut off the relationship. So he goes on to fantasize who some of his fathers could have been.
Ricky Ricardo, Walter Cronkite,
James Brown, Rod Serling,
JFK, Soupy Sales.
revolutionaries, people in the entertainment industry.
And in the context of your novel, he's got a number of little books about how he came from any number of these famous people, potentially?
Yeah, well, those books are bifurcated. It's a do-si-do binding. On one side, he describes what that famous father did to transform the world, and on the other side, what that father might have been like as a father had he chosen to follow his passion with responsibility.
Somebody said recently, we might all be Frank Sinatra's children, but that's...
And if we talk long enough, like my wife says, we'll find out we're related.
We're all...
In our case,
we
don't have to talk that long.
That's right, we know. Okay,
Okay.
The Switch.
The Switch is his first novel, written and published in 1979. After having been a foreign correspondent, reporting on undeclared wars in the Middle East and Central America. And he comes back and he writes this novel about a day on Earth where everyone is switched with their number one nemesis.
Ouch.
So if we go to the next slide, you can see that when you turn the book upside down, it still works as a face because you get to experience the life perceived from the vantage point of your enemy.
All right, next book.
Next book, The Book of Lies, is a true fiction, a thinly veiled novel about Blue's best friend, Samir Braxton, an atheist who swears he's telling the truth and nothing but the truth, so help him God.
Next book.
Narcissistic Planet Disorder is an oversized book about a planet that thought it was the center of the universe. written several years before Ronald Reagan announced his Star Wars program, Narcissistic Planet Disorder, was not only timely, it was prophetic, but it was difficult convincing stores to carry a book that stood 28 inches tall.
And so you've written a book that's a novel about the author of all these books. You've got excerpts of some of these made-up books, and you've designed all these covers.
True.
And let's go on to a next one, just so people
Yeah.
are following
Yeah.
along with what the whole context of this is. If I was the publisher, I would hire you to design my book covers after this. So go ahead, Boxland.
Boxland.
Why are the boxes on their head?
Well, because they live in a land where the corporation has superseded all other jurisdictions, including town, county, state, nation, and continent. And he wrote this after the Bhopal gas leak disaster, and his wife, one of her cousins, closest cousins, died in that disaster, and he was extrapolating it out into this work of fiction. And that's partly about what my book does, is show the life and how the life then yields these different works.
And in a very different vein, next book cover.
All My Men Were Musicians and I'm Tone Deaf, a collection of short stories commissioned by a lesbian couple with a small press who, despite their separatist proclivities, adore the way Blue writes women characters, which he's really proud of.
And people can buy that book or not if they choose, as opposed to the next book.
Titled Buy This Book or We'll Kill You, a novel about a couple of academics who, after 2 years of trying to get their tome on the oral history of garbage published, attempt to blackmail an editor at a major publishing house.
This is like Abby Hoffman's Steal This Book,
Yes.
only with a little more of a threatening edge.
And it would have become just another one of his obscure books if it weren't for an independent filmmaker who made a film based on it, which became a blockbuster. And on the coattails of the movie, his book became his first bestseller, even though the movie bore very little resemblance to the book.
And this is one of the plot lines within the book, is things that he does almost accidentally in some cases that are more controversial than maybe he even intends them to be, are the things that put him on the map.
Yeah, he really is not trying to cause controversy, but particularly later and later in his career, he can't help himself but doing so.
Which says something about the consumer market in the United States?
Well,
in real life.
He can't help, and part of what this book does is reflect the 30, 40, 50 years of American global culture that he's writing about. Sometimes it comes out of his personal life, but sometimes it reflects these broader issues, and it also parallels the publishing industry and mental health industry and academia, institutions that he intersects with.
So let's go to his little murder mystery trilogy here.
So actually his daughter becomes ill, and he starts to get the hang of what it takes to write a bestseller, because he needs money to help her get the best medical care she needs. He writes the first murder mystery, A Damn Good Plot, which is followed by, go to the next slide, One Good Plot Deserves Another.
Nothing like a good cemetery joke.
Followed by Plotsville, based on the hit movie inspired by the Good Plot book. So you see he's got a thing going with movies.
And let's just go on from Plotsville to
Outsourcing Grandma, a 1999 novel, takes place in a globalized world where Made in America could be made in the Philippines or China, and Grandma could be a 12-year-old girl with knitting needles.
we're going to play a video that's related to the book. You want to set this up for us? This is a video representation of one of the books, a passage from one of the books.
The book is called No More Mrs. Nice Guy, Confessions of a Nice Catholic Girl. And it grows out of Blue's experience with his daughter for an intense period of about 3 years where they were in a lot of waiting rooms of doctors' offices and clinics and hospitals. And so translate that to the book. Now we meet Paula Martinez in the waiting room of a doctor's office about a year or so after she'd been diagnosed with cancer, and she's been waiting for a little while.
All right, some of the text of No More Mrs. Nice Guy as acted out on this video.
By La Bruja.
I'm reading this bestseller by this famous psychologist guy about the power of forgiveness. He's pounding his thesis like a 12-inch nail into my head, same point, over and over. The really annoying thing is, he's leaving out a tremendous amount of information and his reasoning is fuzzy. I can write his whole book in a single paragraph, in one sentence. Why even bother? I pick up a 3-month-old magazine. The cover article is written by the same famous psychologist guy. I've been waiting 45 minutes. I woke up to the receptionist and say, I understand Dr. Crenshaw is a very important man and that his time is extremely valuable and mine is worth nothing. But can you give me a clue how much more of it I have to waste before I get called in to wait in yet another room and have to sit there half naked, feeling vulnerable and humiliated for God only knows how long? I don't really say that. I don't even get up from the chair. I just sit there staring at the waiting room paintings. The large sunset watercolor, the lighthouse painting with the whitecaps lapping over the rocks, the big-eyed puppy dog prints. If this doctor is as good in medicine as he is in his taste in art, I am in serious, serious trouble. After waiting 30 more minutes, I do get up and talk to the receptionist. Excuse me, ma'am, how much longer do you think? My appointment was for 2 o'clock and it's 3:15. I realize I'm just a patient, but I'm really not that patient a patient when it comes to waiting in waiting rooms for hours after the time of my appointment. Someone behind me starts clapping. 2 or 3 others join in. I turn around, all 9 people are applauding my little tirade. 2 of them are standing. 3 more stand to join them. I'm getting a standing ovation for being a pushy asshole. I'm not really sure it's a good thing reinforcing this kind of behavior.
Oops, they called her in.
They called her in, so it worked, being kind of pushy.
A lot of people can identify with that experience in a doctor's waiting room and the thoughts that they have and whether they actually go up to the receptionist and act on them. But this is a reflection of how much in the multimedia world you really are. You have a book that's text and visuals in print. You also have a few different videos that grow out of the book like
Short
this.
films of the excerpts.
And you're working on something with some Rutgers students?
So I'm also using this as an educational tool. And at Rutgers, I'm doing a residency where in addition to doing a performance reading and we're having a panel discussion, working with Rutgers students who are writers and designers to complete several of the Blue Mobley books based on the excerpt. So writing students, fleshing that out into completing the novel, and then designers working on making an ebook of that.
Show us one more video.
Why don't we go to How Bad People Go Bye-Bye?
Let's.
A pull-out pop-up book on the history of capital punishment.
Now, even just this idea, this is a children's pull-out pop-up book on the history of capital punishment?
Which grew out of Blue's younger daughter asking, because she saw something on the news about someone being executed later that night, what is that, Daddy? And so he wished he had a book that he could pull out and show. And his first children's book. And let's take a look at some of those pages. In early times, when a man did wrong, pull the tab, we threw some stones till he was gone. Then, if someone killed or stole, On the guillotine their head would roll. Nowadays, a prick in the arm, and the bad man can do no harm. And this book became a controversy, as you were alluding to, was banned in all, school libraries all over the country.
The author and designer in real life, Warren Lehrer, my brother, now the author of his 10th book, A Life in Books, The Rise and Fall of Blue Mobley. Warren will be presenting tomorrow at 5 p.m. at the Neuberger Museum on the SUNY Purchase campus in Westchester, tomorrow, Thursday, 5 p.m., and then February 13th at the NYU bookstore. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
It's been a pleasure.
And that's our program for this week. We're here with a new episode each week at this hour, and tune into my radio program weekdays on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. Tomorrow on the radio show, can the State of the Union proposals become actual policy? I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.